Hello, and welcome to the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective. I'm Tony Aguilar. Just 2 years after leading the Labour Party to an historic victory, Prime Minister Keir Starmer now faces a different political reality. The question is, how did Labour lose such support in such a short period of time? Is it because of challenging economic times, or is the Labour Party facing a crisis that it needs to address quickly? The question is, can Keir Starmer survive for another few years to deliver on the promises that he made to the public? The future of the Labour Party. Keir Starmer. That issue is next. Joining me today is Dafydd Townley, Senior Teaching Fellow of International Security at the University of Portsmouth in the United Kingdom. Dr. Townley, thanks for joining me today.
It's a pleasure, Tony. Nice to be back on again.
Let me start this. Obviously, in May with the elections, the Labour Party suffered a tremendous loss. But you do have a situation now where people are thinking about, should Keir Starmer resign? Andy Berman, for example, is thinking about running. My question to you is, given the tremendous loss that the Labour Party has had, why would Mayor Burnham think he could win as a member of the Labour Party when it seems as though the nation has gone against Labour? What makes him think he could win?
Well, I think this is the very situation in which the Labour Party finds itself. So, and actually, just in the last 24 hours, of discussing this with some of my students, about who represents the working classes, not just in the United Kingdom, but also in the United States. And traditionally, certainly in the 20th century, the Democratic Party in the United States were the party of the unions. They seem to be representing the working people. But certainly over the last, shall we say, the last 10 years or so, maybe the last three election cycles, the working classes have seemed to move towards the Republican Party, and the Democratic Party have been, as a consequence, being seen to be a party of sort of middle classes and the elite to a certain extent. And that's been the same issue that has faced the Labour Party for the last 30 years. So its roots are in socialism and that of representing the left, very much ground in the idea of trade unionism and workers' rights, responsible for the growth and creation and growth, I should say, of the welfare state in the post-Second World War era, and is very much seen to be representative of the working man, and as a result, was very much seen to be responsible, not necessarily high taxes, but fair taxes, taxes, those that are successful or rich, you might call it that, um, sort of a more egalitarian society. And that is where it remained. But certainly during the late 1970s, early 1980s, and with the growth of globalism and neoliberalism and neoconservatism, if you want to look at it that way, in the 80s under Thatcher, there was a shift in the country to the right, away from that high taxes. We see the changing of credit laws, where suddenly people are able to buy their own houses. There is a move away from traditional class structures, and we see the growth of social mobility in this country. Now, as a result, the Labour Party are seen as being essentially a fringe party, or a party of the left, a radical party during the 1980s. Those that, for example, support the campaign for nuclear disarmament are within the Labour Party, and so the Labour Party is seen as being a party of opposition, but not necessarily electable. That changes in the 90s with New Labour. which initially or comes into power in '97 with Tony Blair, and that sees the Labour Party shift away from its socialist background, or at least its left-wing background, and more towards a political centre. And it becomes increasingly more attractive to many within the United Kingdom. And of course, Blair gets into power in '97. But the party itself struggles to find its real identity of the Blairites and what you call so, more socialist left wing. And so this party seems to be, in much the same way as the Democratic Party in the United States, seems to be fighting itself for its true identity. Now, at the end of Blair's time in power, actually at the end of the Brown government in 2010, the party goes into decline somewhat, but while it's out of power, it tries to find its identity, and it's generally accepted that it tries to shift back towards the centre. And then we have Jeremy Corbyn coming as the leader, who is a left-wing politician, and his leadership is again divisive. And so Starmer is seen when he comes into power in 2020, not into power, but as leader in 2020, he is seen as being somebody who is able to unite both the left and the centre part of the Labour Party. Unfortunately for him, the vast majority of the left, the working class, has left the Labour Party, has felt disillusioned. They voted, for example, for Brexit. They are seeing the Reform Party, or was then UKIP, but Reform Party is more representative of their own interests, less of the Labour Party being that voice. And so as a result, we see the Labour Party then becoming estranged from its traditional roots. And Blair is seen as the cause of it, but Starmer is seen as continuance of that estrangement. And so what is currently finding is trying to find alternatives to Starmer to try and win back some of those working class voters, especially in the north of England, who are feeling disenfranchised from the Labour Party, that don't feel as though either them or the Conservative Party are really representing their interests, and they are turning to the likes of Nigel Farage and so on. Now, or alternatively, they're turning to the Green Party, which is the left wing, or becoming a left wing movement. Now, as a result, we've got the likes of Andy Burnham, who is essentially offering should we say, a more working class alternative to Starmer. Starmer's, the fact that he's a Knight of the Realm, for example. There has been questions straight away whether he could be, leader of the Labour Party, if he could be like Knight of the Realm. But he got his knighthood for being for an excellent lawyer representing humanitarian law cases, but also as a chief of the prosecution service in this country. But Burnham, remember, he's not an MP yet. And he has to become leader of the party. He or Angela Rayner might actually be that champion of the left that offers an alternative to him. But
She's
whether
had
they
her
are able
own
to,
she's had her own problems with taxation, so her
she
star has
has,
come
but
down a little bit.
she's been cleared in the last
Okay.
month. So she's been those accusations were looked at. She's been cleared about that. It was about stamp duty on. So in the UK, you get an allowance to have a second home if you live so far away from Parliament, but you still have to pay taxes of some sorts on that. And there were some questions about whether she should have paid more taxes, but she was cleared of that last month.
Mm-hmm.
And she is actually, as far as potential candidates to replace Starmer, she's probably second within the Labour Party because she does represent a working class background. There are some others, but Burnham really has to become. Well, first of all, he has to become an MP to become Prime Minister. And so there is a special election coming on at the moment, and he is standing for that. In the past, he's been denied by Keir Starmer the ability to stand in that position, and so this is the position that we find ourselves in now. That the Labour Party is trying to find that identity again, of whether it's going to its traditional working class roots, or whether it's going to stay centrist.
Starmer has said he will not stop Burnham from running this time. He will not put any obstacles in his way. But the question still remains is, even though he's mayor of Manchester, but still, he's still affiliated with Labour. And he's looking to run at a time where people will have that most in their memory of what Labour is. And I guess the question is, what would he bring to the table that is so different from Starmer?
Well, he has genuine cross coalition appeal. So his ability to appeal to the left and to the centre. He's got some governance experience, as he has been in Manchester. He's got credibility with the working class and with the progressives. He also offers something, at the moment, the United Kingdom's economy it's not faltering, but it's, we're in no way we're in a boom period, for example. But the golden goose of Brexit was supposed to be, essentially a greater economic partnership with the likes of the United States, for example, and realigned, more favourable trade deals with Europe. That hasn't really come about. Now, that's not Starmer's fault. That's just a consequence of Brexit. And Burnham has suggested that he would be sympathetic to European Union alignment. Um, he's slightly more left-leaning than, for example, Wes Streeting, who is the other major competitor for Starmer. Um, but as I said, first of all, he's got to win that by-election, and that in itself is probably, is if he's likely to win it, but it will be an indication of the sort of the challenges that Labour under him might find in the next election as well. Um, but I think at the moment that we are Starmer's biggest issue is at home. He's not had the results that um, he's had overseas. His foreign policy has been particularly good. He's been excellent in dealing with Trump. He's seen by the vast majority of Europeans as a capable and sensible leader. We just this week we've hosted Volodymyr Zelensky and various other European leaders about Ukrainian defense for the future. He is one of the two main leads when it comes to the coalition of the willing, in support of Ukraine. He's reached out to China, which is not an easy job. We want to do business with China, but we recognize that China offers certain security threats to us. So you have to have that tight balance. And he's been particularly good at that. The problem is unfortunately, a great deal of what he's done at home has met with considerable backlash. The U-turns that Starmer has done on certain policies, and every time he goes against any of his pledges that he made during the 24 election, are coming back to give his opponents greater ammunition to criticize him. So I think from a domestic perspective, Starmer is doesn't have uh, the uh, the standing that he does overseas.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions I wanted to ask you is the Reform Party has obviously picked up in terms of popularity, headed by Nigel Farage. And the question this used to be kind of the old Brexit party. And my question is, why are people in London or in United Kingdom going for a man who supported something that has not really panned out as well as they thought it would? I mean, Nigel Farage tries to paint himself as this outsider, but he's been an insider for years. And so why is he getting rewarded for something that quite frankly has not worked out? That puzzles me.
Well, of course, the irony is that his biggest policy is around immigration.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that is essentially his main flag that he is standing by. Okay, so it's very harsh immigration laws, essentially repatriation of people. There's questions about who is English, who isn't English. Um, And of course, the main cause of our immigration issues, which, by the way, we had record low migration last year under Starmer, which nobody has actually really blown about a great deal. But the main cause of that is essentially Brexit. Brexit has been the main cause of our immigration issues, which, ironically enough, was what Nigel Farage campaigned for the best part of a decade to get out of Europe. You know, while he was a European member of Parliament, calling for its end, and so he has created this through essentially by withdrawing from certain agreements and also allowing our European neighbours to have no responsibilities to limiting immigration into the United Kingdom as it had done before, or even taking back those that have entered illegally from Europe into the UK. And so Farage is tremendously charismatic. Whether you agree with his policies or not, and you've got a guy in power over there, in the White House who got there, whether you agree with his policies or not, he knows how to work his audience, not everybody's audience. And Farage knows that. Farage has known since 2014 exactly what buttons to push with the working classes. The idea that that there are that the European Union is dysfunctional, that it is essentially undemocratic, and this sounds very much actually like Project 2025 or Trump's national security strategy, for example, which at that and the national defense strategy have called for the dissolution of the European Union, for example. Now, these are the same sort of things that Farage has done, and he has said that that is essentially a undemocratic organization that is removing our sovereignty, which it's not. If we're part of a federation, you have to accept that sometimes it doesn't go the way that you want it. That's the way of democracy. Of course, it's not the way of Nigel Farage's democracy, unfortunately. So what we're seeing at the moment is Farage has now tapped into a great number of fears. Of course, what he's saying about immigration is he's certainly working into people's fears of national security issues, about potential terrorists coming into this country because they're not going through the vetting systems, that criminal gangs are taking advantage. And of course, this is all an environment that is created essentially by the fact that he was successful in getting Brexit. Now, Farage has also come under significant criticism for not being in his constituency very often. There's a lot of questions about some of the funding that he's received, various different, very incredibly wealthy people, various dark money suggested, or at least some from dubious sources that suggested that he is potentially funded by people who are more interested in their own interests than those of the United Kingdom, for example. And he has told this week or last week that he was really quite badly embarrassed in the House of Commons last week in uh, Prime Minister's question time when he tried to take advantage of the current tragic situation about Henry Noack and
Oh,
his killing.
yes. Hmm.
Um, and despite significant um, uh, uh, number of statements by Mr. Noack's family that they don't want his death to be used as a political football, he continued to use it to try and make some political points in House of Commons, and so he is a very divisive character. In the people who agree with him wholeheartedly, and there are those who absolutely dislike him incredibly.
Just to be fair,
There's very little in between the two.
just to be fair, I mean, he's not the only one who's taken advantage of that situation.
Oh, absolutely not.
Tammy Badnock has been taking advantage of it as well, and it has created tensions, obviously, within the United Kingdom in terms of immigration. Um, but as we were speaking earlier, also the events that took place yesterday in Northern Ireland, in terms of in terms of that. And again, immigration is being put out there as the cause of the problems that people have, whether in Northern Ireland, the United Kingdom in general. I mean, so how do you go against that? And what is the administration of Keir Starmer doing to combat that type of thinking?
If I had that answer, Tony, I'd probably be in power. If I had the answer that could find a solution. Look, I think the first part of that question. So how do we deal with it? First of all, I think that under previous governments, and it hasn't been changed so far, but under previous governments, we have made it deliberately more difficult for people to apply for asylum in this country. Okay, and that is partly a consequence of Brexit, but also a consequence of us wanting to reduce the number of people coming into this country for whatever reason, whether it's lack of jobs, etc. But we certainly found out during COVID, for example, when a large number of Eastern European workers went back home, that we are very reliant on migrant workers in this country, much like the United States, who relies on a great deal, especially in agriculture, in this country, fruit farms, etc. A lot of the service industry, especially things like restaurants and delivery jobs, for example, are filled by migrant workers in this country.
Mhm.
But I think that we need to probably invest more in making sure that our asylum process and the vetting process is quicker and more effective. And that way, then we can deal with an increased number of applications rather than having the people coming across on the so-called Brexit boats, as they've been called now, the illegal crossing of the Channel. What Starmer can do about this, we've seen last year that the number of people that have come into this country at a record low since Brexit. So he is doing something in that way. I think the only way that we can do this is essentially is to work closer with the likes of France and so on, and also to come down on the illegal gangs that are included in this process and are making a considerable amount of money of it. How do we make it not a divisive issue in this country? I don't think we ever will. All of my life, there has been, whether much like the United States' history, there's a different immigrant that has become as a different target. So certainly in my young days, the Irish immigrants into this country, even though they've been coming into this country for hundreds of years, were certainly vilified as a result of the troubles in Northern Ireland. And then it sort of turned into, various other, Eastern Europeans as we came into Europe. Then obviously in post 9/11 and post also 7/7 attacks in this country, it has moved towards those from the Middle East, even though arguably we are responsible for a great deal of them being displaced from their places of origin. So I don't think that there's a solution that means that we can, as a country, come together and sort this out.
Let me ask you this. There's another problem that's facing the United Kingdom right now, and that's the involvement of Elon Musk in British politics, particularly with people like Tommy Robinson. So, how is that going to affect the election, assuming that there's no election, let's say to 2029, if Starmer can survive that long? But how is Elon Musk's involvement going to disrupt British politics, particularly with someone like Tommy Robinson?
Well, we know you you as an American know how disruptive Elon Musk can be to the democratic process, of your own nation. Certainly, the amount of money that he threw into the American presidential election, for example, and has threatened to put in more money into the midterms as well, supporting people that he has. He has the wealth to do that, and we've certainly seen him give considerable amount of support to Tommy Robinson with his Unite England March or Unite Britain March. I think it was last year. We've seen, him getting involved again. He's talking about how we should react with anger, etc., or at least, how we should stand up to immigration into this country. This is, and you know, it it's not just Elon Musk. I mean, you've even got to look at the likes of JD Vance last year talking at the Munich Security Conference, and even just last week at the D-Day commemorations, you've got Peter Hegseth warning Europe about immigration. Just the most inopportune and crude moment, to make a political point. That was not the place to say that. And it's difficult to deal with that, but I think Starmer has been pretty good. I think the one thing I think actually, if we have Elon Musk become increasingly involved in the elections over here, I think it will actually work against Nigel Farage, and I think it will also work against the likes of Tommy Robinson. We are, as much as we are historically guilty of interfering in other nations' elections, we are incredibly resistant to other people trying to get involved in our own elections. And I think that actually it might backfire on Robinson. Certainly, Musk has been told by Starmer that he's wrong to get, essentially shouldn't be getting involved in. David Lammy has sort of said certain things about about what should and shouldn't be said. It's very interesting, but I think actually that if that was to continue, it's not the same as, for example, um, Musk get involved in American politics. Even though he's South African, raised in Canada, if I remember rightly, and then naturalized American at some point.
But
But
isn't this really, we have situations, not just Elon Musk. You
no,
have people like Peter Thiel, who's out
yeah,
there as well. And I mean, Elon Musk is the more charismatic, gregarious person out there. But people like Peter Thiel, for example, provide an intellectual base for people to go to the right, so to speak.
yeah.
So, but the question is that there is an audience for this, whether it's in the United States, Germany, Poland, wherever, um, that does like this type of thing. They are fans of it, and so the question becomes, what does the government, i.e., Prime Minister Starmer, the Parliament, or whatever, what responsibility do they have to combat this kind of speech or and the like?
Well, I mean, we don't have the same free speech laws as the United States. Okay, so we don't have the First Amendment. We do have slightly stricter, although of course I like the idea of free speech, but there are laws around free speech that still limit what you can say. So to a certain extent, you're absolutely right. You can say whatever you want to say, but there are consequences to what you say, or potential legal consequences to what you say. So I think we support that as well in the United Kingdom, but I don't think that at the moment that there is. Now you mentioned Kemi Badenoch as well, but Starmer's political opponents are currently making sure that those extreme voices or those alternative voices to the mainstream are being heard around the ideas of free speech. And I think it's difficult for any government to come in and say, that needs to stop simply because they would then get accused of being authoritarian and shutting down free speech. So how do we get around that? I don't. I honestly think that there needs to be better communication in this country about the variety of political views, and but much like the United States, and I think this is the same for a number of countries, not just the UK and the US, but there has now come a point where you can't have that discourse between people of radically opposing views to simply agree to disagree on certain things, but agree on others. So it's almost as if in this country that if you agree with Nigel Farage on one particular thing, then you have to agree with everything that he agrees with. And that in turn has to be the complete opposite of pretty much of what Keir Starmer stands for, which is not the case, of course. And it was, the United States, arguably in its heyday in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s, had two parties that had very, two main parties, I should say, that had very different views, but came to a consensus on a lot of things. They agreed on certain things. They agreed what was best for the United States movement. Now, that more often than not, they agreed on the objective, but disagreed on how to get there. And at the moment, we are unable to have that conversation in this country between two opposing sides. We don't have calm political debate in this country. Nowadays, we tend to have simply dissent and arguments and political point scoring. And the whole days of political debates have actually disappeared a great deal now. The last time, I can honestly believe that the last time that we sat down as a parliament and I actually listened to frank and open discussion about a political moment was around the parliamentary debates around intervention in Syria.
Mhm.
And it was probably one of the real moments in British politics where people actually got up and spoke about their heart and about what the constituencies they represented. Um, we don't tend to have that nowadays. We tend to have essentially shouting across the aisle, and that day of consensus, I think, is much needed in this country.
Mhm. Let me ask you this. Can the Labor Party, because the question is, as we started, the issue is, can Keir Starmer survive? That's one. Can he survive to 2029, which would be the next general election? And what would it take for him to survive? Because it seems to me that he's not a charismatic figure. Let's be realistic. He's not charismatic. Some would say he's quite boring, but in certain places he has been quite effective, particularly when it comes to foreign affairs. He has certain ideas on the table. Give 16-year-olds the right to vote in the next election, and that's good. But what can labor do? And I guess and I asked this question because I was interviewing Helena Rosenblatt, who wrote the book The History of Liberalism. Um, and it seems to me that what people affiliate with the left, which would be Prime Minister Starmer, is not really accurate, nor is it historical. So the question is, how does he broaden his vision? How does labor broaden its vision to be totally inclusive of the working class, but not dismissive of the middle class and the upper classes, that presents a greater vision for the United Kingdom? How do they begin to do that?
So I think to do that, they would have to replace Keir Starmer, to be quite frank. And I think they would probably have to go with either Andy Burnham or Angela Rayner, just simply to appeal to the working classes. The fact that Starmer is a knight of the realm sort of just,
Mhm.
put some distance between himself and the working classes. So I think that's one issue. And of course, they could quite easily replace Starmer. Anybody who can stand against Starmer, it's part of the Labour Party laws or Labour Party rules that anybody can mount a leadership challenge. And Starmer said that he would stand if there was a challenge to his position. Margaret Thatcher did the same on a number of occasions. When she finally did step down, it was quite clear that she probably wouldn't win the election for the leadership, but that was her decision to move rather. She jumped before she was pushed, I should
Mhm.
say. But Starmer, you know, I think it was 90 MPs called for him to leave in the last few months, um, mostly around his appointment of Peter Mandelson as well, not so
Ambassador.
much around his not so much around his appointment, but around the lack of his judgment around that. Because Mandelson, by most accounts, for the Americans that I've spoken to and those within the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office that I spoke to, Mandelson was an extremely effective ambassador in Washington D.C. and had certainly had made good inroads with the Trump administration. So if he was to be removed, that wouldn't cause a general election. So Starmer, goes, it wouldn't cause a general election. Certainly you would have the likes of Farage and you'd have the likes of Kemi Badenoch calling for a vote of no confidence in the government,
Mhm.
which would have to be passed for there to be another election. But Labour could simply swap leaders at that point. Now, obviously, there's unlikely to be any challenge until after the election, and should Andy Burnham be elected into the by-election, should Andy Burnham go into the party. Now, it's not clear whether Andy Burnham would call an immediate leadership challenge, or even Wes Streeting, but it's clear that Streeting would offer essentially a continuance of Starmer's policy, whereas actually Burnham would offer, or Angela Rayner would offer something quite different. And so I think that, the original partnership of Starmer and Rayner was quite effective at the start because Rayner, as Deputy Prime Minister, could appeal to those working class people. Um, Starmer just doesn't.
Mhm.
And if we have Burnham and Rayner as a partnership going forward as perhaps leader and deputy prime minister, then it may well be something that could get some of those votes back. But
Mhm.
ultimately, I think at the moment, the economy's not doing too bad. It's not doing great, but we're not in decline. We are bracing ourselves for the impact of the war in Iran over the next couple of months. Certainly, that's going to hit global economies, not just us. But at the moment, the good things that Starmer has done, people aren't really feeling them. So, things, for example, like the NHS waiting list that he wanted to bring down, he's achieved that. But he's U-turned on some things that he said he would never do. So, for example, winter fuel payments to old age pensioners, he said he wanted to cut it, and then that came back to it from the backbenchers decided that was unacceptable, so he had to change his mind on that. Then it was around welfare payments that had to be changed as well, and so he's seen as being quite weak in this country. But as you rightly said, overseas it's been seen as quite strong. So I'd find it difficult for Labour, if they keep Starmer, to win the next general election.
Is it because Starmer, at his heart, is not really on the left? I mean, he seems to be against the welfare state to a degree, which is a conservative perspective. So, if he ran on the labor promises, and you're saying that he had pretty much has turned against a lot of those. So it seems to me that the problem is that the labor movement under Starmer has simply abandoned its its promise to fulfill some of the things like the welfare state and the like, which is a legitimate item of discussion. But he has turned his back on that. Would that be accurate?
Well, he's come into this. He's came into power with the idea that he would be responsible in public spending. Okay, which and I can remember my late father saying to me, the Conservatives build a great economy, and then the Labour Party come in and spend it. That was his history of growing up, and then you'd have another, Conservative Party would then build it back up again, and that to a certain extent, when Tony Blair came into power in '97, we were benefiting from, an improved global economy, post Cold War, reduced defence spending. We had more to spend on things like education. But he came into power, essentially saying there'll be no changes in taxation, but we have strict fiscal rules by which we will conduct public spending, and he's kept to that. But that's not the traditional, you know, positioning of the Labour Party. The positioning of the Labour Party is traditionally, we will increase spending in education, we will increase spending in the National Health Service, reduce defence spending, we'll tax the rich, etc. And that's not really come into that. he has, for example, done some things that traditionally Labour Party. So he started to nationalise some of the private, or to bring some of the railways back into public ownership, for example, which hasn't been done since the 1970s. There's a huge period under Thatcher where pretty much all of the national assets, the industries that we had were privatized. And he's brought some of that because they are not working well enough. He's brought that back under the government rights. But I think you're right. I think unfortunately, I mean, he's only been a politician since what for 10 years, 11 years. Um, and so he is probably best suited to a courtroom where he is very methodical, produces lots of evidence. He doesn't have to be charming as such, he doesn't have to be sort of a Los Angeles lawyer, in a defense case, but he can be very sort of, because it's a lot more, how can I say it, a lot more process driven in the UK rather than charisma. But we've sort of become used to having very charismatic prime ministers. You can say what you like about Boris Johnson, and a lot of people do, but he was very charismatic. And that's how he managed to get elected as often as he did. And the same for Tony Blair. Same even for Margaret Thatcher. But, if you look at Starmer's positioning, it's not been that different to his predecessors. But the problem is he's set by these rules and he's kept to them, and that's upset a lot of people on the left. So it's that positioning for him. He needs to decide whether he's going to stay there or whether he's going to look to try and win over some of those working class people by giving up some of these rules and shifting back across to the left again.
It sounds like you believe that the Labor Party can regain some of its prominence that it had 2 years ago when they won. But they have to do it under someone else, perhaps Andy Burnham. Um, how long do you think Starmer will remain in office, given all of the pressure there is now for him to resign?
Well, I think we'll have to see, first of all, what happens with Burnham. And I think after the first round of the leadership votes, if there is any challenge, we'll give some sort of indication. If Starmer doesn't have at least 60% of those first votes, I think that he might be forced to reconsider his position. Um, the other, I mean, I, I have briefly mentioned it. We've spoken about reform a little, but the other fly in the ointment, as far as the Labour Party concerned, is the Green Party, which made huge gains in the local elections as well as reform. Not as much as reform, because reform have taken essentially the Conservative Party's vote away from the Conservative Party. As much as we're talking now about the Labour Party, the Conservative Party in this country is in downward spiral, has been for the best part of 5 or 6 years, and it's there's no end there. So at the last election, it was decided by the public that they were too far right to a certain extent. And so the response of the Conservative Party was to go even further right, which has even lost them votes. But I think that if we look at, for example, the Green Party and also the Liberal Party, who made some advances as well, what we might see is those who don't want to side with reform but believe that Labour don't represent them might well turn to the Green Party again, and that or even go to the Liberal Party, and that would weaken Labour's position in the next election. This election, certainly, or the last election, I should say, was as much about the disintegration of the Conservative Party and the fact that reform weren't seen at that point as the credible alternative to the Labour Party. And what's happened over the first 18 months of Starmer's time in power has been, as I said, a lot of these U-turns, which has seen a lot of people now believe that Nigel Farage and his party are a credible alternative to Labour, and I think that has to be changed, and it won't be done, I don't think, under Starmer.
Given with the few minutes we have left, if let's say Farage wins, and you and I have spoken about his potential victory in previous sessions, But what would that mean? We've spoken about domestic issues. He will be to the right. But what would it mean, for example, for foreign affairs? I mean, what would it mean for British alliances and things of that nature? What would a Farage victory mean? But also, what would a Burnham victory mean in terms of foreign affairs?
So I think if well, I'll deal with the second one first. So if Burnham wins, I think we will see United Kingdom becoming more aligned with Europe a great deal more, and I think will become more integrated. No, we won't become part of the European Union again,
He
but I
has
do
said
think
he
that we
wants
would
to
be part of
join
it.
the he wants to do another
But
referendum on it.
I think yes, but then again, it's just like the first referendum. It's not necessarily a cause for them to become in part. We don't have to deal with, referendums as just simply opinion polls on a national scale. So, one of the positions that David Cameron put himself in during that first referendum was he essentially said, "Well, I will abide by that referendum." He didn't have to. And so, if there is another referendum and it says we want to join Europe, and I think actually that would actually happen, is that I think that I think there's a great deal of buyer's remorse for a lot of people about Brexit. So I would say that much like Trump, there's probably about a 30%, 30 to 35% of the UK that don't want anything to do with Europe. But I also think that there's a good 30% that are capable of swinging one way or the other. And I think that, half of them came out and voted to leave Brexit. And I think that that vote is probably now regretting that position. So I think Burnham would probably become more aligned, although I don't think that we would. I don't think that we would necessarily become part of the European Union again. We may have a privileged position. We may go something like the Norway positioning. We may have something where maybe even that we are a preferential partner of Europe. Uh, if Farage gets there, then I think we would align ourselves considerably more with the United States. Farage sees Trump and the United States as being, more politically um, in line with his own views. The issue for that, of course, is that Trump is only likely to be in power probably until 2029. Um, but if, for example, J.D. Vance were to win or another Republican were to win the election in 2028, it may well be that he might see that that is the way forward. And personally, it might, even though it's a long way off, I do think we'll probably have a Democrat in power in 2029. Now, whether that is somebody who is willing to get a lot closer to the United Kingdom than it currently is, that on a more preferential position, it's possible. But we didn't really get there under Biden, so there's no guarantee of that either. Will we see, a greater integration, for example, with China? Canada has seen China as an alternative to United States as far as trade is concerned. Will we pick up more of that slack, in that respect? That's to be seen. Um, will we try and forge greater partnerships with Middle Eastern partners? It depends. There's a huge amount of impetus to try and get great deal of investment in artificial intelligence in this country, data servers, etc. We've deliberately not put any guardrails on its development to try and entice people to come in, essentially to set up business here. Um, it's interesting to see whether we will be attractive in that respect. I don't see, whatever happens, I don't see whether if it's Burnham or Farage, I don't see our position, for example, on NATO changing, and I don't see our position on Ukraine changing. The reason why I don't see our position on NATO changing is quite simply we are wholly reliant, apart from defence of the realm, on NATO for European defence, and as a result, as an extension, our own defence. We don't have the capabilities that we have of 40 years ago. We are extremely specialist. We even with the increase to 5% of GDP by 2035 on defence, that's not going to be enough to really fill a significant gap that we still have in our capabilities. But I think that NATO will still be incredibly important to us. Where where we end up as a nation by 2035, it would be, I will be in my 60s then, but I will still be, eagerly watching and hoping that it's a positive place. But it's certainly, I think, whether it's Burnham or Farage or a another, because there's always, somebody else might come out of the woodwork, and we wouldn't have said 10 years ago that Nigel Farage would be Prime Minister. But there are people, that we now have to take that idea seriously. I mean, who would have thought that 20 years ago we would have been talking about Donald Trump and Nigel Farage as potentially leading the Western world?
Exactly. If you were a betting man, come 2029, who would you say would be prime minister? Someone from reform, such as Nigel Farage, or Andy Burnham?
I think it's 50-50. I think the one thing you can put money on is the number one, the problem for the Conservative Party is they've probably got a decade before they are a serious political force in the UK again, at least a decade. The things that could change the next election in 2029 is, first of all, there could be further scandals surrounding Nigel Farage. I mean, we talk about Teflon Don. He is the Teflon Nigel. The mud doesn't stick to him. It just comes off him. But we may see the Green Party split the Labour vote as well, and that might damage them more than Reform do. Will we end up having perhaps an Andy Burnham and a Green Party coalition? Possibly. That might be something that is left wing enough for both individuals to be happy with. It's certainly an alternative. You know, I actually think that apart from the fact that we entered an age of austerity during the last coalition government, it worked particularly well. But I'm not sure whether that might be it. It'll either be Farage, I think, or it'll be a coalition. I don't see a Labour majority at the next election, but we may well still see a Burnham as Prime Minister as part of a coalition.
The way is going to be quite interesting to see what happens in the next couple of years.
Absolutely.
My guest today has been Dr. Dafydd Townley, Senior Teaching Fellow in International Security at the University of Portsmouth in the United Kingdom. Dafydd, thanks for joining me today. It's been a pleasure as usual.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Join us again next time as we deal with another issue of international importance here on the Aguilar Conversations, A Global Perspective.